You watched him conquer Paris. You watched him bend an empire. You watched Ragnar Lothbrok become the most feared name in Europe. But here is what nobody told you. Ragnar's greatest victory wasn't Paris. It wasn't the gold. It wasn't the terror. Ragnar's greatest victory was his own death. And he planned it. The show gave you a broken old man thrown into a pit of snakes. A tragic ending for a legendary warrior. But the real story of Ragnar's death is far more disturbing than anything the show depicted, because Ragnar didn't stumble into that pit. He walked into it, eyes open, smiling, knowing exactly what would happen next, knowing that his death would unleash something far more devastating than anything he had ever achieved alive. Today, you'll discover 3 things that will change how you see Ragnar Lothbrok forever. First, why Ragnar deliberately sailed to England with only 2 ships on a suicide mission that his own sons begged him not to take. Second, what actually happened inside the snake pit, including the famous last words that turned an execution into a declaration of war. And third, how Ragnar's death directly created the Great Heathen Army, the largest Viking invasion in history, which destroyed 3 English kingdoms and came within inches of erasing England from the map entirely. The show ended Ragnar's story in that pit. History says that's exactly where it began. Picture Northumbria in the year 865 AD, a Saxon kingdom on the northeastern coast of England. Cold, gray seas, stone churches, a Christian king named Aelle, who believes he has just won the greatest victory of his reign. He has captured Ragnar Lothbrok. In the most famous Viking alive, the man who humiliated Paris, the man whose name makes Christian children cry, Aelle has Ragnar in chains. He has him beaten, starved, dragged through the streets. He has built a pit and filled it with poisonous snakes. And he is about to make the worst mistake any English king has ever made, because Ragnar is not afraid. Ragnar is not broken. Ragnar is exactly where he wants to be, and the words he is about to speak from inside that pit will echo across the North Sea and bring the entire fury of Scandinavia crashing down on English shores. After Paris, Ragnar was the most famous Viking alive. His name was sung in every mead hall from Denmark to Norway. Kings paid tribute at the mention of his fleet. Warriors crossed oceans to serve under his banner. But fame is a fire that consumes its own fuel. By the late 800s and 50s, the gold from Paris was spent. The warriors who had followed him were older, slower, scattered across Scandinavia, raising families on farms bought with Frankish silver. Other jarls had copied his methods: river raids, monastery attacks, strategic terror. The techniques Ragnar invented were now common currency. Every ambitious Viking with 3 ships and a crew was calling himself the next Ragnar Lothbrok. And for a man whose entire identity was built on being singular, on being the one name that mattered more than all others, this was unbearable. Was Ragnar jealous? Was he desperate? Was he losing his mind? The sagas hint at all 3, but they agree on one thing. Something changed in Ragnar during those years. The cold, calculating strategist who had patiently built his legend over decades became restless, reckless, consumed by a hunger that no amount of past glory could satisfy. His sons were grown now. Ivar, the brilliant cripple who could not walk but whose mind was sharper than any blade in Scandinavia. Bjorn Ironside, the warrior who had raided the Mediterranean and returned with stories that made even seasoned Vikings fall silent. Ubi, the diplomat. Hvitserk, the loyal. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, marked from birth by prophecy. 5 sons, 5 potential legends, 5 men who were beginning to cast shadows larger than their fathers. And this is where the psychology of Ragnar becomes terrifying. A normal father would have been proud, would have stepped aside, would have let his sons carry the name forward. But Ragnar was not a normal father. Ragnar was a man who had told the world that immortality matters more than life. And now his own sons were threatening to make him irrelevant while he was still breathing. The sagas describe what happened next with a brevity that hides the madness underneath. Ragnar announced he would invade England, not with a great fleet, not with thousands of warriors, with 2 ships. 2. His sons were horrified. Ivar argued against it with cold logic. The English kingdoms were stronger than they had been a decade ago. Aella of Northumbria had built defenses specifically designed to stop Viking river attacks. 2 ships against a fortified kingdom was not bravery. It was suicide. But Ragnar had already calculated the outcome, not of the invasion, of his death, because Ragnar understood something that none of his sons had grasped yet. He was getting old. His body was failing. And the illness and injuries of 30 years of warfare were catching up to him. If he died in bed, he would be forgotten within a generation. Another old Viking who faded away. His sons would become the story. His name would become a footnote. But if he died spectacularly, if he died at the hands of a Christian king, if he died in a way so brutal, so public, so impossible to ignore that every Viking in Scandinavia would demand vengeance, then Ragnar would not just be remembered. He would become immortal. His death would be the spark that lit a fire no one could extinguish. Was it genius? Was it insanity? Was there even a difference anymore? Ragnar loaded his 2 ships with just enough men to make the crossing. He embraced his sons one final time. Ivar's eyes burned with fury and understanding, because Ivar, the one son who thought exactly like his father, already knew what Ragnar was doing. The old wolf was not sailing to England to conquer. He was sailing to England to die, and his death would be worth more than every victory he had ever won. The 2 ships left Scandinavia in the late summer of 865 AD. Lean vessels, skeleton crews. Not enough men to raid a village, let alone invade a kingdom. Warriors who had heard Ragnar's call and answered anyway. The same kind of hungry, desperate men who had followed him 30 years earlier when he was nobody. But this time, the mission was different, and the men on those ships must have known it. The North Sea crossing was brutal. The sagas describe storms that tore at the sails and cracked the masts, waves that swallowed men whole, and the kind of weather that Vikings interpreted as Odin testing the worthy, separating those destined for Valhalla from those who would drown in obscurity. Ragnar stood at the prow through all of it. The sagas say he didn't flinch, didn't pray, didn't grip the rail for balance. He simply stared toward England through the salt spray and the howling wind with the calm focus of a man who has already accepted his fate and found peace in it. Was the storm real? Or did the skalds add it later to make the story more dramatic? It doesn't matter, because what happened when the ships reached the English coast was real, and it was devastating. A storm, real or exaggerated, wrecked the 2 ships on the Northumbrian coast. The vessels broke apart in the shallows. Warriors dragged themselves onto the beach soaked and exhausted. Weapons lost. In supplies scattered in the surf. The greatest Viking strategist in history had just washed ashore on enemy territory with a handful of half-drowned men and no way home. And then Ragnar did something that proves this was not a failed invasion. It was a calculated surrender. He didn't hide. He didn't retreat. He didn't try to steal boats or send for reinforcements. He gathered his surviving men and marched inland, directly toward Aella's territory. Not raiding, not burning, just walking into the heart of an enemy kingdom as if he wanted to be found. Aella's scouts spotted them within days. Northumbrian soldiers surrounded the small Viking band in open countryside. It should have been a minor skirmish, a handful of shipwrecked raiders being mopped up by a local garrison. Instead, Ragnar fought. The sagas describe a vicious, short battle. Ragnar's men forming a desperate shield wall against overwhelming numbers, outnumbered 10 to 1, perhaps more. Fighting not to win, that was impossible, but to die well. To die in a way that the Skalds would remember. One by one, they fell. Ragnar's warriors cut down around him until he stood nearly alone, swinging his axe, bleeding from multiple wounds, his hair matted with salt and blood, his eyes burning with something the Northumbrian soldiers had never seen before. Not fear, not desperation, satisfaction. They took him alive. That was their first mistake. King Ælla was overjoyed. The most famous Viking in the world, the man who had humiliated Paris, the name that had terrorized Christendom for 3 decades, captured in chains in his kingdom. Ælla paraded Ragnar through the streets. He displayed him before his court. He sent messengers to other English kings announcing his triumph. He wanted every Christian ruler in England to know that Ælla of Northumbria had accomplished what no king in Europe had managed. He had caught Ragnar Lothbrok, but Ælla didn't understand what he had actually caught. He hadn't captured a defeated enemy. He had captured a loaded weapon. A weapon designed to detonate the moment it was destroyed, and Ælla was about to light the fuse himself. Because while Ælla celebrated, while his court feasted, and his priests thanked God for delivering the pagan monster into Christian hands, Ragnar sat in his cell, silent, calm, waiting, not for rescue, not for escape, for the pit. Ælla wanted a spectacle. He wanted Ragnar's death to be a message, a warning to every Viking who ever thought of raiding English shores again. When he wanted the most famous pagan in the world to die screaming, begging, broken. He wanted to prove that the Christian God was stronger than any Norse myth. So he built the pit, a deep stone chamber dug into the earth beneath his fortress, filled with adders, vipers, every poisonous serpent his men could capture from the marshes and moors of Northumbria, dozens of snakes writhing in the darkness at the bottom, the smell of venom and damp stone rising from the hole like breath from a grave. Ælla's court gathered to watch, Saxon nobles in fine clothing, bishops with crosses on their chests, soldiers who had fought Ragnar's men on the beach, all of them pressing forward to see the great Ragnar Lothbrok finally destroyed. They dragged him from his cell, beaten, starved, his wrists raw from chains, his body covered in bruises and cuts from weeks of captivity. The man who had entered Paris on Easter Sunday, now stumbling through a Saxon courtyard in rags. But his eyes. Every account, Norse and Christian alike, agrees on this detail. Ragnar's eyes were not the eyes of a broken man. They were calm, clear, focused. The same eyes that had studied the walls of Paris from the prow of a longship. The same eyes that had watched Charlemagne's grandson beg for mercy. The same eyes that had calculated every move for 30 years. Ragnar was not afraid. He was ready. They brought him to the edge of the pit. Below, the snakes coiled and hissed in the darkness, the sound rising up, a dry, rattling whisper like sand pouring through bones, the stench of venom thick in the cold English air. Ælla spoke. The sagas give different versions of his words: mockery, triumph, a declaration that God had delivered the pagan monster for judgment, that Ragnar's gods were powerless, that Thor and Odin had abandoned their champion. Ragnar looked down into the pit. Then he looked up at Ælla, and he smiled. Not the desperate grin of a man trying to show courage, a real smile. The smile of a man watching his plan come together perfectly. The smile of someone who knows something that everyone else in the room is too blind to see. They pushed him in. The fall was short, the impact hard. Ragnar hit the bottom of the pit, and the snakes struck immediately, fangs piercing flesh, venom pumping into his blood. 1 bite, 2, 5, 10. his body convulsing as the poison spread through his veins, and Ragnar began to speak, not screams, not prayers, not begging. He began to recite his victories, one by one, the raids, the conquests, the kingdoms that trembled, the cities that burned, the gold that flowed. His voice rising from the pit like smoke, filling the courtyard, forcing every Saxon in attendance to listen to the autobiography of the man they thought they had defeated. The sagas record that the recitation went on for an extraordinary length of time, Ragnar naming every battle, every enemy destroyed, every king humiliated, his voice growing weaker as the venom took hold, but never stopping, never breaking, never begging. Ailla's court fell silent. The celebration died. The triumph drained from their faces as they listened to a dying man recount a lifetime of conquest that made everything they had ever achieved seem small. And then Ragnar said the words that would cross the North Sea, the words that would reach his sons, the words that would ignite the largest invasion England had ever seen. How the little piggies would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The piggies were his sons. The boar was Ragnar. And the message was not a cry for help. It was an activation code, a trigger designed to transform grief into fury, mourning into invasion, 5 individual men into a single unstoppable force of vengeance. Ragnar died in that pit. The venom finally silenced the voice that had terrorized Europe for 3 decades. His body lay still among the serpents. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, finally closed. Ailla's court erupted in celebration. The monster was dead. England was safe. God had prevailed. But Aella had made the fatal miscalculation that Ragnar had been counting on from the moment he loaded those 2 ships in Scandinavia. He had killed Ragnar publicly, brutally, in a way that was impossible to ignore or forgive. And Ragnar's sons were listening. Ivar received the news first. The saga describes his reaction with chilling precision. He gripped the handle of a knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white and blood seeped from his palm. His face showed nothing. No tears, no screaming. Just the cold, focused silence of a mind already calculating the exact cost of vengeance. Bjorn Ironside roared. Threw furniture, smashed everything within reach. The warrior's response, pure physical fury that shook the walls of the hall. Ubbi wept. Hvitserk reached for his axe. Sigurd, snake in the eye, stared into the distance with the prophetic stillness his mother Aslog had given him. 5 sons, 5 reactions, 1 conclusion. England would burn. Within months, the brothers assembled the largest Viking fleet ever launched. Not dozens of ships, hundreds. Not hundreds of warriors, thousands. The great heathen army. A force so massive that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a document written by the English themselves, could barely find words to describe it. This was not a raid. This was not a campaign for gold or territory. This was vengeance. Pure, calculated, overwhelming vengeance designed to make the entire English-speaking world pay for what one king did to one man in one pit. Ragnar had engineered this from the beginning. The 2 ships, the deliberate wreck, the calculated capture, the public execution. On every step designed to produce exactly this result. His death was not a failure. It was the most sophisticated act of strategic martyrdom in medieval history. The old boar had died exactly as he planned, and now the piggies were coming. The great heathen army landed on English shores in 865 AD. The earth trembled under their boots, hundreds of longships blackening the coastline like a plague of wooden dragons. Thousands of warriors who had crossed the North Sea for one reason, the name Ragnar Lothbrok. Ivar led them, the cripple who could not walk but whose mind cut sharper than any sword in Scandinavia. He did not charge blindly into Northumbria. That would have been his brother's instinct. Instead, he did what his father would have done. He waited. He planned. He turned patience into a weapon. The army struck East Anglia first, not because Ælla was there, because Ivar needed horses, supplies, and a base of operations. He forced King Edmund to provide them under threat of total destruction. Edmund complied. He had no choice. The size of the army was beyond anything England had ever seen. Then Ivar turned north, toward Northumbria, toward Ælla. The fall of York was swift and merciless. The capital of Northumbria, one of the great cities of Anglo-Saxon England, collapsed in a single assault. Ælla's defenses shattered, his soldiers scattered. The king, who had built a snake pit for the most famous Viking in the world, watched his own kingdom disintegrate in hours. Ælla was captured, dragged before the sons of Ragnar in chains, the same way their father had been dragged through Northumbrian streets. The symmetry was deliberate. Ivar wanted Ælla to feel exactly what Ragnar had felt: the humiliation, the helplessness, the knowledge that everything you built is about to be destroyed. And then came the Blood Eagle. The sagas describe it with horrifying precision. Ælla was pinned face down. His ribs were cut from his spine one by one. His lungs were pulled through the opening and spread across his back like wings. A ritual so extreme that modern historians still debate whether it actually happened. Did it happen? The Christian chronicles don't describe the method. The Norse sagas do, in vivid, specific detail. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was identical. Ragnar's death had been answered with something so devastating that no king in England would ever forget the cost of killing a Lothbrok. But Ivar was not finished. Ragnar's son understood his father's philosophy perfectly. One act of vengeance was not enough. The terror had to spread. The legend had to grow. The great heathen army did not stop at Northumbria. It turned south. East Anglia fell next. King Edmund, the same king who had provided horses, was captured and executed. Mercia crumbled. Its king fled. 3 English kingdoms destroyed in less than 5 years. The systematic annihilation of Anglo-Saxon civilization carried out by men fighting under the banner of a dead man's name. Only Wessex remained. One kingdom. One last wall between the sons of Ragnar and the complete conquest of England. And in that last kingdom, hiding in a swamp, a sick young scholar named Alfred was about to prove that Ragnar's legacy had limits. But that is another story. What matters here is what Ragnar achieved. Not in life, in death. The 2 ships were not a failure. They were a delivery mechanism. The snake pit was not an execution. It was a stage. The famous last words were not a dying man's rambling. They were a weapon of mass mobilization. Ragnar understood before anyone else that in a world ruled by stories, the most powerful thing a man can do is control the narrative of his own ending. He chose when to die. He chose how to die. He chose what his death would mean, and he chose correctly. 1,000 years later, his name is still spoken. Series, books, games, academic debates about whether he was one man or many. It does not matter, because Ragnar never wanted to be proven. He wanted to be remembered. And every time someone speaks his name, every time a child hears the story of the snake pit, every time a historian argues about whether the Blood Eagle was real, Ragnar wins again. The old boar is still grunting, and the piggies are still listening. If you want to follow the trail of destruction that Ragnar's death unleashed across England, subscribe now. Because the sons were even more terrifying than the father.